Well, the leaves are starting to fall here at Dogwood Hall, and that puts me in mind that it's time to talk about time. And so what I want to do is cover a couple different topics. Of course, I don't want to miss my opportunity to talk about one-to-one time since I do promote its use, although I don't have a strict preference for it. But I use it very much in the way that PACT originally intended as something that occurs between adventuring sessions. But we also want to talk about not just the time system that I use, which I call the PACT time system, which includes some more information about the way I use phases and being conscious of which phase of the game that you're in, as far as which timekeeping systems you prioritize. We also want to talk about then calendar time and adventure time and tactical time that we might use in combat and other kind of fine scaled temporal actions where the passage of time in small units really matters. Now, beyond just the time that we use in game, though, I want to talk, of course, about the way other cultures here on Earth relate to time. And so that's where I think we're going to start, is talking about sort of some types of time that we might think about as categories that we're using when we're planning our adventures. And then also the way broadly different cultures relate to time, and then a system of classification or categorization, putting the ways that broadly speaking cultures relate to time. It's a biaxial system where we look at time as a quantity versus time as a quality, and time as cyclical or reversible versus time as irreversible, which when I think of, modern chronological time, time's arrow goes going forward, never able to go back. We'll start by just covering a sort of typology of time. And of course, the one that most people are going to be familiar with is the chronological time, Greek chronos. And that's this quantitative time with the explicitly formulated rules for measuring and segmenting temporal units that we often think of as objective time or scientific time. It's our very standardized seconds, minutes, hours, days, and that we can precisely monitor under controlled conditions, such as you might find in the practice of the sciences, versus kerological time, or keros from the Greek. And this is where we're starting to branch into a more qualitative, relative period of time with temporal units that relate to personal experiences of individuals and that are ordered by the events of their lives. So the birth of a child, the passing of a parent, these are things that mark personally our relationship to the passage of time in the world around us. And then we might also talk about the analogical time from Ionos, from the Greek, and that may feature both quantitative and qualitative attitudes towards time, but with an overall reference towards the cyclical or looping nature of events. So when we talk about the cycle of day and night, that's we'll get to as a more iterative look at looping time. If we look at it in terms of the season, that the year begins in spring and passes to summer, then fall, then winter, and there are all these kind of activities that we associate with a specific season. But by and large, the cycle then will repeat itself year after year. We may, turning back to the chronological time, keep track of a succession of years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or this is the year 2024. Next year will be the year 2025. And so on and so forth. And there are multiple calendrical systems that are prevalent in even mainstream societies in the world today. And so we might track the time by any of those. But in the terms of the analogical time, we're just looking at the cyclical, repeating, looping nature of those events. So we know that we go out and sow the seeds in the spring, and then we harvest in the fall, and we associate them with just different points in that cycle where we're supposed to be doing different things, and that can extend into the ritual calendar, but that can also just be the quotidian events of the everyday life. The next thing we want to look at then is sort of broadly, or at the most broad level, different ways or orientations that cultures have towards the recognition of time, or the passage of their relationship within the passage of time. And this is from Edward T. Hall, who's a well-known anthropologist for the concept of proxemics, although a lot of anthropology students probably only associate him with that. He is, for me, one of my guiding lights, and is probably far more important to me as an anthropologist than to most other anthropologists. But he introduced through several books, The Hidden Dimension, Silent Language, and Beyond Culture are probably the three that I would recommend for everyone to read. This concept of M time and P time. So the first, monochronic time, is firmly in the realm of the quantitative timekeeping, and it emphasizes schedules and segmentation of time, and promptness in terms of being on time for your scheduled meetings and that sort of thing. So it's scheduling, often with an exactingly detailed plan for the future that you could explicitly articulate. And, we'll find that there are associations with the control of space that are brought out based on attitudes or orientations that people within a culture have towards time. The second, then, is going to be polychronic time, which is highly oriented towards the qualitative timekeeping, however, with multiple simultaneous engagements. Now, here we're not just talking about simple multitasking, like I worked on a project while I ate my lunch kind of thing. But where this simultaneous engagements are the norm, and the emphasis of involvement of individual people and the completion of transactions over the absolute adherence to a schedule. And so for most of the people in the industrialized West, I think we would probably understand ourselves to be firmly within the realm of monochronic time. However, it bears making the point that these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive categories. Typically, a particular culture is probably going to dominantly be operating within one or the other of these sort of orientations towards time. But there may be aspects of the culture where you can see signs of the other orientation. So, one of the examples would be Japan, for instance, might be thought of as being very exacting in terms of being prompt in terms of showing up when you're scheduled for a meeting or for work or whatever. But that usually has to do more with things like scheduled meetings and work, firm commitments like that. In other ways, than less formal areas of culture, they might be thought of as more polychronic, and that was something that Hall brought out. And I'll provide references for these works so that you can go and check them out on your own time. But then the other thing is, so in monochronic time and the ways that affects the control of space, you might think about going to a meeting at an office. If you're somewhere in the industrialized West, you might expect to sit, be greeted by an administrative assistant who confirms that you're scheduled for the meeting and asks you to sit and wait. When you go into the office space, you might be sitting in a chair on the opposite side of the person whom you've come to meet, and there is a desk interposing between you, and you have very formal, regulated interactions during your meeting. Whereas with polychronic time or P-time cultures, what you might find is that you show up roughly when you're scheduled. You may be confirmed for your appointment, but you'll sit outside in the waiting area where Probably someone will come around and talk to you, double check exactly what you're there for. And if there's someone that, might be better suited for your needs, they can say, oh, well, maybe you ought to go down the hall and speak to so-and-so rather than this meeting. And then when you get into the meeting space, the interior office, instead of sitting in a chair across a desk from the person that you've come to meet with, you may be guided towards a settee or a chair and couch arrangement around a coffee table, and meet in a less formal space. Maybe with both of you sharing the same small couch or settee kind of thing. There's a lot more that goes to it in terms of what you might expect in terms of monochronic time might be much more formal in terms of keeping space between the individuals at the meeting kind of thing, but this departs from time, whereas polychronic people might be more inclined to be very close to one another. In some cultures, if you're not close enough to smell the breath of the person that you're talking with, then they're being standoffish. Why are they standing so far away from you? You might find that odd. Clearly, for many of us in the industrialized West, if somebody, even if they don't have bad breath, if they're standing close enough that you can smell their breath while you're talking to them, you might feel that they were standing too close. And that gets more into proxemics than chronamics. But there is definitely a correlation between orientation towards time and the use of space. Now we come to the point of wanting to put different cultures or a large number of cultures into a sort of framework for understanding how those different groups of people might relate towards time and might be separable by their different cultures. And to get to that point, we're going to look at these four patterns of a time concept that were first elaborated by Mionesuke Mita. So Professor Mita is a sociologist from Japan who's also been very influential in my thinking about time. And he really kind of broke things down into these this biaxial system where we have our pretty typical four quadrants, and on one axis we have then where time is perceived as being more of a quality, where we're back to talking about relationships towards things that happen to us or through us in time, and versus time as quantity, where we're actually counting minutes, hours, days, and we're counting them in a succession and keeping particular track of them over extended periods of time, as it were. And so what we might look at it is Professor Mita called them the primitive societies. We might today be more inclined to call them traditional societies, where we have a form of iterated time, and that's where we're still talking about cyclical time. But I think here, just for clarity, what we'll do is we'll distinguish between circular time when we talk about the Hellenistic world, and then just cyclical or iterated time when we're talking about these more traditional societies, where we might see things as broken down by day and night. That's usually one of the earliest distinctions in terms of different times. And then we might keep track of days within a cycle of the moon, but that starts to take on more of the quantitative character to it. And so such a traditional society might be moving closer or along one of those two axes in different ways. And so then our second axis is time as reversible versus time as irreversible. And so when we're talking about reversibility, we're still talking about these cyclical or circular orientations towards time, but we're also looking at in terms of with the iterated time, we're not necessarily tracking the accumulation or the accrual of different cycles or repeated cycles, and then that would of course take us farther down the right toward on the time as quantity axis. But with then circular time, we're really looking at cycles and looping time still, but maybe with more inclination to keep track of, where we did one cycle, now we did 2 cycles, now we're doing the 3rd cycle kind of thing. And so we'll kind of then move up and look at the other side of time as quality, where Professor Mida talks about Hebraism and linearly divided time. And, I'll link, of course, to the article, but in his argument, he's saying that if you've had difficult relations with your neighbors for such a long period of time, you no longer are as interested in the cyclical nature of time. You're more inclined towards it happens once and then never again. We're moving from a beginning to an end. So in terms of the linear divisions, he very much focuses on that division between beginning and end, archeos and telos from the Greek. And just to kind of further illustrate that, though, might be the concept of the halakhic time, or halakhic hour, or the relative hour, which is something that comes out of Judaic law from the, we'll say, 1st century of AD. So they would keep track of 12 hours per day and 12 hours per night. However, the length of the hour was divided evenly according to the amount of light on the given day during that part of the year. So because there is a longer period of light during a summer day than there is during a winter day, the length of the hour was relative according to the time of the year. So an hour would be longer during the summer than it would be during the winter. And so it gives you an idea of how things might be linearly divided and yet still moving along that axis towards being considered irreversible. So we're looking at the times of keeping track of historical events that, this is the past, that's the future. And here's the beginning, there's the end. And all of those 2 that we've covered so far then are kind of where societies are oriented towards Gemeinschaft. And we can talk about more about Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. Here's another thing I'll put a link down to. Go back and look at my culture and community video where I get into the history of those terms and what they mean. So next we'll move on and we'll look then towards time as a quantity, and we'll go to the bottom right quadrant here where we're talking about Hellenism and circular time. And here's a case where Professor Mida points out that in the early Greek, the Homeric texts, you don't find as much consciousness of time. You may find nighttime, daytime, sort of the iterative time that we talked about with more traditional societies. But as you get then into the, let's say, 6th century BC, we start looking at some more cyclical or even circular considerations of time. That this is certainly true with Anaximander, and then again he goes into a lot of detail with the Pythagoreans, looking at not just that time was iterative, that these cycles repeated, but that there was progress overall, even though the cycle itself was going through a whole circular event cycle and then back to the beginning, but then you'd start a second new cycle. So they were keeping track of differences between cycles. And he also kind of points towards the beginnings of concern with civil society, and particularly he points out that they were timokratia, that the people were being considered citizens or instrumental in deciding which laws would become the laws of the land based on property ownership, and that also amongst the earliest money economies based on coins that was happening in this area of the world, the Lydian coast, and then all along the sea there through Greece, we're starting to use coins. There's some arguments to be made that India or even China all were beginning coin-based money economies around the same time. In fact, China might have even been a couple of centuries earlier, as early as the 8th century BCE, although it might also have been a little later. That's not exactly clear. Many textual accounts and hadn't been sorted out through archaeology either. And so then he kind of points towards that interest in then the money economy as becoming the basis of keeping track of quantities, the compiling numbers kind of thing. It was all coming together in this interest in this new attitude towards civil society as opposed to the personal relationships of Gemeinschaft, where that was leading to a lot of sort of clan-based warfare in the old world. They wanted something that was where the rules were written down and for everybody, and even if the rules were only being decided by property owners, that continued to be a dominant form of deciding who would be responsible for laws well into the 19th century, even 20th century in some less formal ways. And then, of course, the last is going to be linear time, which he's saying is modern society, and that might largely be the industrialized West, and then those of us who are doing business in the industrialized West, where we're looking at time linearly. It's highly segmented, that we call, objective time or scientific time, where we, keep very, very careful track, and also that we have a standard tied to what those time periods are, and that would all kind of go together towards being more of the society based on civics, on legal precedents and rationales for certain behaviors, rather than just personal and community-based connections, as in Gemeinschaft. And so the next thing we'll look at is then going back into spatial awareness and its connections of time. And rather than try and dig down into these different individual cultures, we're going to put aside the human scale of time and start looking at the landscape scale of time and space, and this will speak to world building. So that'll be next. Well, it's been a few days since I've started doing work on shooting this video, and that little gap in time turned out to be a good thing because it gave me some space to remind myself that I had wanted to add in another concrete example when we're talking about cyclical or circular time. And the example that I wanted to bring to this is drawn from Hinduism, where one of the major sacred figures is Brahma, along with Vishnu and Shiva. Now, the idea is that a single day in the life of Brahma lasts for 4.32 billion years. Now, that's the long cycle. There's another kind of philosophical basis for using short cycles which are thousands of years rather than billions and millions. But we're going to stick with the long cycle. And so now that day is called a kalpa. And of course, following the day of Brahma would be a night of Brahma, which is a time of dissolution, and that's called pralaya. But it's also can be divided into 4 aspects, but I don't want to get into that because the point is not here to get into a philosophical or theological discussion about Hinduism. It's to just concentrate on the way another culture or religion has dealt with timekeeping in a cyclical or circular way. So the kalpa, 4.32 billion years, can be subdivided then into the Mahayuga cycle. Now, the Yuga cycle also has these 4 phases, and they go in order. They are the Satya, the Treta, the Dwapar, and the Kali. And each of these cycles is kind of based on an increment of 432,000. So the last of the cycles, the Kali, is 432,000 years. The first then is 4 times that number, so 1.7 odd million years. Then we come down to, like 1.2 million years. I'm going to get the exact math. And then 864,000 years, and finally 432,000 years. So there's a ratio to the Yuga cycle where it's 4 to 3 to 2 to 1. And the first of the cycles, the Satya, is a time when humans are highly metaphysical. We're, in tune with our higher spiritual selves. We're not engaged as much with material conditions. We're in this highly positive moral state where we're not reduced to things like poverty and war and materialism and that sort of thing. And each of those gets progressively more materialistic and more base as they go along. So the Treta then sees the first reduction or diminishing of the quality of the spiritual life of the human. Then we get to the Dwapara, and that's where, an even greater step down, and finally the Kali, where things are at their worst in terms of human nature and inclination towards materialistic wants, and only concerned about hedonistic pursuits, and with problems like war and poverty constantly beleaguering the human population. But again, what we're really looking at here is this different way of looking at cyclical time. So we'll have that full period of the Brahman day go through 432 billion years, or by taking up these 1,000 Yuga cycles, each of them are going to be 4.32 million years. But the cycles are not themselves internally of equal duration, right? The first one is 4 times the length of the last. Before we leave off this concept, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we might make use of these kind of time-space scales in terms of world building without as much concern for the human or humanoid populations and their orientation towards their perceptions of time. And now we're looking at kind of just changes that are happening on the environmental global scale, and what are appropriate units of analysis, or if not units of analysis, what we might find in scientific and environmental studies, that what we're, in terms of what you'd think about being able to recognize. And here I guess it bears mentioning that this could apply somewhat to humanoids in our fantasy game worlds, because, let's face it, elves live for thousands or more than 1,000 to a couple thousand years in the case of AD&D First Edition. There might be other games where you have immortal beings, or D&D would obviously have NPCs that are immortal or even longer lived than elves. And so kind of this is not just in terms of what would be useful in terms of understanding the limits of scales of or units of analysis for scientific study, but also kind of what beings at different life lengths and even size scales, I suppose, to a certain extent, might be aware of or concentrated on more than other scales. And so these are coming from Paul and Hazel Delcour's work. I'm going to link again to a book called Quaternary Ecology, a Paleoecological Perspective. And I'll also provide a link to an article that has these diagrams in it, and that might be a little easier for most people to find, because I think the book itself now, I just looked, I think you can get a soft cover copy of it for a little over $90, depending, I guess, where you're having it delivered to. It looks like the hardcover copies are well over $100, so they're probably not worth most people buying just to get these two charts, or reading the text that is only going to be minimally relevant to fantasy world building. But anyway, we'll look at this and say that we're up to about 500 years or so, and then the micro scale is out to about 10 to the 6th power in meters squared. So what we're looking at there is just about obviously a million meters squared, which would be a hectare, 100 hectares. That's going to be roughly just a little under 250 acres, and out to about 500 years. Then we look at the mesoscale, where the scale of landscape ecology, where we see kind of the changes into smaller landscapes. Now we're looking out to somewhere about 10 to the 10th power. So we'll say, we'll just say in square miles, that's going to be about just a little under 4,000. It's like 3,800 and some square miles, and then kind of going up to about 10,000 years in time. Then and also if you kind of reflect back to if you're hex maps, then if you've got about 30 square miles in a 6-mile hex, you've got about 500 square miles in a 24-mile hex, and that's distance from center point to center point. Then if you're at 4,000 square miles and 24-mile hexes, you realize you have about the landscape ecology scale is not getting any finer than about 8 hexes each, kind of big scoops of coarser analyses. And so then we move out to the macro scale, where now we're looking at a million years in time, and we're getting closer to 40,000 square miles, and now we're up to the size of small states or countries and that sort of thing. Of course, bigger states and countries are going to be way more than that in terms of area, 40,000 square miles, but that gives you an idea of the limits or the coarseness of quaternary studies overall. So in the coarsest level, you're looking at the mega scale, going billion years at a time. What kind of changes over large areas, but you're not necessarily uniformly seeing the changes at the small scale. You might find, if you dig into a particular point on any given spot of the globe, you might find evidence of changes, so that would apply to that particular area, but you can't broadly say too much at what was going on at the finest scale. You're sort of limited to analyses at the larger scale. And so but you have available to you different types of analyses. So this next slide, what we're looking at is then that same scale but applied to different areas of analysis. So environmental disturbance regimes, the biotic responses, and the changes in vegetational patterns. And we're looking at what the scale of time on the left hand or right hand axis, and then the scale of space on the top and bottom axis. And they're the same numbers, left and right and top and bottom. But what you can see here is then on the environmental disturbance regimes, at the smaller scales in space and time, we can see the kind of disturbance events like wildfires and wind damage and clear-cut forests and smaller areas of flooding and earthquake damages and that sort of thing. But as you get into larger scales of time, like longer periods of time there, where we're over much larger areas of space, we can see changes wrought by anthropogenic change or human activities, kind of thing. And then you kind of get it to the top level there, where your analysis of changes in plate tectonics is limited to over a million years in terms of your finer analysis, your least coarse analysis. It might get as fine as down to them, and it could obviously individually be something slightly less than that, but generally it would be a million to a billion years of time and at large areas of space. So we're talking about over 10 to the 11th or 10 to the 10th, somewhere where that lines up. And then we'll look at the middle, and then we're seeing the biotic responses, and then on the right-hand side, we're looking at changes in vegetation. We're down at the lowest level. We're looking at herbaceous plants and changes in shrubbery and that sort of thing. A little higher up on the spatial and temporal scales, we see trees or whole stands of trees, changes in subtype and type of tree, overall formation and compositions then of the forests themselves. And then at the very highest level, we're looking at sort of global terrestrial vegetation changes where, we're seeing that at the highest level of, coarsest resolution of time and space. I also kind of misspoke during my previous taping of this episode when I said that the book Quaternary Ecology, a Paleo-Ecological Perspective, was going at $108. I actually double-checked that again, and it seems like on Amazon you can find used copies of either the hardbound or the softcover that were like in the range of $10 to $20 kind of thing, and that has the diagrams that you're seeing in this video in there. I'll also provide a link though where they were published in a smaller article about scales in spatiotemporal scales and quaternary studies kind of thing that might be more accessible or more freely accessible. The book that I was thinking about when I said the cheapest copy around, as far as I could tell, was about $108, is this Long-Term Forest Dynamics of the Temperate Zone, which I would highly recommend because it has, like in this particular case, we're looking at maps of stages of how far south or north different species of trees are. Now, in this particular case, it's limited to North America, but then we're going year by year and showing, from roughly 20,000 years ago, last glacial maximum, end of the Wisconsinian glacial stage, how far south trees, like in this particular case, hickory, were growing at the time. And just to give a better idea of what that might look like, hopefully this will show up a little better on screen. This is one of the volumes of the Decade of North American Geology, which is published by the Geological Society of America. Highly recommend the series, but it's expensive if you want to try and put the whole thing together, and probably not that worthwhile for fantasy world building. In this particular case, though, what we have is North America and adjacent oceans during the last deglaciation. And I bring this out because it kind of has the same maps, and I wanted to show some of those. This particular volume includes some large plates in it, which gives you an idea for some of the different species, and I don't expect that you can probably make that out entirely, but how they were distributed, starting with, again, said 22,000 years ago, the end of the Wisconsinian glacial period, glacial stage, and beginning of the last glacial maximum. And we can kind of show this too. These maps are slightly larger. So that may stick out a little bit better. Just to give you an idea of what we're doing with these particular long-term, large spatiotemporal scales. So we're talking about changes in vegetation on a large regional stage where we're getting up into the 40,000 square miles and more territory at long periods of time, over 1 million years kind of thing. In this particular case, we're looking at tens of thousands of years, but we're still looking at much larger territories. Now, what I don't have is much coverage of the rest of the world in terms of geology. Since I work here in the United States, I'm mostly concerned about North America in terms of having to document geological and other environmental backgrounds for reports that I write. But I do have late Quaternary environments of the Soviet Union, and this gets into the same kinds of maps But for the Pleistocene then of the former Soviet Union, some of the same kind of pollen diagrams that you'd find there, different maps showing distributions of different types of vegetation. Another check. This second one then it would be the same kind of maps, but for the later Holocene period, so within the last 12,000 years or so. So the next thing we want to talk about then is going to be one-to-one time. I won't say that much about it, but as I mentioned at the beginning of the game, I do kind of promote its use, even though I don't insist upon it. And you know, if you're going to talk about timekeeping in role-playing games, you have to talk about one-to-one time. However, we also want to touch on that famous Gary Gygax quote about how you can't have a meaningful campaign unless accurate time records are kept. Since that quote is in the same section where he talks about one-to-one time, very often it seems to be getting conflated in that what he means is one-to-one time is what you need to have a meaningful campaign. And there's really a couple things going on there, but that's not one of them. So in terms of one-to-one time, I would use it just like Gygax was talking about as limited to between sessions. I had another quote somewhere along the way. I didn't preserve the source because I never thought I was going to have to actually quote Gygax, but it was another source where Gygax goes into, briefly something along the lines of, well, of course, once you're in game, you can play out however you need to in terms of spoken word between the players and the DM. You can cover an hour in 5 minutes, or you can take an hour to cover 5 minutes, kind of thing. It's just all what are the needs of play during the game. When we talk about then one-to-one time, you come up here, sweet. Then we're just talking about what's going on between sessions. And so we'll kind of use the example of, I think most people assume that the calendar in your game world is going to be the same as the calendar in the physical world. That is something that will make timekeeping, or at least calendrical timekeeping, a lot easier for most people. So that's probably a good idea. We get to the last section. I'll mention again that my calendar is actually based on 12 months over 240 days, and that's because I always take 3 months out to work on whatever's going to happen the next year in game. But we'll talk about that more in a minute. So let's just for now talk about real world to game world being the same length of year, length of months. You can rename them, but essentially they're going to be the same months. So if we are meeting to play in the physical world on the first day of the month, and the game world is also on the first day of the same month, and we go through play of 14 days during the game, let's say we, travel out 5 days to the dungeon. We spend, 4 days in the dungeon, and then we travel back 5 days. We've spent 14 days. So in the game world, we've moved all the way ahead to the 14th. But then let's say that our next physical meeting for play will be on the 8th, 1 week later. Now, one of the things that I've heard as far as the interpretation of one-to-one time, and I think I understand why that would be the case, and this is sort of the thing that I wanted to talk about, is that you could not play that character when you met again on the 8th because the character was left off on the 14th. And that's one that I understand that preserves the direct alignment between physical world calendar and game world calendar. They don't get out of sync anywhere. The second, I think, probably more important thing is I think that is done for the most part to eliminate the possibility that players will be in dangerous situations when they're not under control of the player. And that's something that wasn't necessarily the case in the original use of it. where players may have to spike the door and eat iron rations for a week until the next time, or the characters would have to do that until the next time the players came back to play the game. And that's something that could leave them vulnerable to being killed midweek at some point. Maybe it's random rolls done by the dungeon master throughout the week, or just before, as a preparation to the next play session, they go through a bunch of rolls just to see if the party was attacked by random or wandering monsters, that sort of thing. And I think a lot of contemporary players just don't want to take that risk, or don't think they should ever have to have their characters in that kind of position. And, that's, I guess, understandable to a certain extent, that you could potentially lose a character when it wasn't directly under your control. And I understand that's hard for a lot of people to accept. That was part of the old, one of the reasons you had a stable of characters, though, was that you had plenty to fall back on. Now, I use it a different way, and I use it in what I believe was the original intention of Gygax and what he used for his own games. Someone can always correct me on that, but I just move time forward on all sides. So instead of waiting until you would meet again a week later on the 15th, and all of a sudden now you're beyond where your character was, so you can play them again. Uh, I would say that when you come back on the 8th, that's a week later, 7 days later, the date, so your character left off on the 14th. Well, they're now at the 21st, 7 days later. Their calendar is moved ahead in 1-to-1 time, day per day. So you're not synced up between the real world and the game world, but time passes at a 1-to-1 rate. That's just the way I use it. Your mileage may vary, I guess. So the last thing then that I want to talk about is the PACT timekeeping system, and a little bit more about my world, as I got into in the last section. I use a different calendar. So when I talk about calendrical time, I'm talking about a world where the world rotates around the sun in 240 days. It's a slightly smaller world on a slightly smaller orbital path. It has a slightly smaller moon that has a similar spatial relationship. I talked about my cosmology in the Hunting Down Dragons video, and I'll put a link to all these things then down in the video description. But what I really wanted to get at was we'll touch again on phase. And, with phase, I think I'll also try and link to the Far East Amusement Research's standard role-playing system, or at least a kind of document that's floating around out there that's the basic SRS, which is available under an open license for non-commercial use. Although I think all the English translations have been undertaken by enthusiasts who happen to speak both English and Japanese, or I don't think any of them are official interpretations from Far East Amusement Research. But it's a great game system, and it really drives home the way I use phases. Or actually, I mean, originally where I got it from is the more scenario-based system of Japanese role-playing games, where there's kind of an opening or introductory phase, and then there's this middle or research phase, where in many cases the party will split up to achieve different goals, and then they'll come back together for the climax or the final fight to finish off, the big bad evil guy, or accomplish the final task that needs to be done to save the day, or whatever the case may be. And I've subsequently realized that there are a lot more people in tabletop role-playing games and just fantasy world building in general that are aware of Kisho Tenketsu. I've seen a lot of videos after. I also got into that in the Hunting Down Dragons, or at least I outlined my version of, the whole introduction, rising tension, middle phase or research phase, the twist, and then the concluding phase. And that's where I got that from. I didn't spell out that it was Kisho Tenketsu, but that's, and obviously I don't purely use that because they also incorporate some more concrete conflict ideas, as I got into in the PACE campaign planning video. And again, I'll put links to all this stuff. And so the thing that I want to talk about with phase here is not the outline of the phases or what's going on during them, but to also be mindful of these phases of play on the level of an individual session. So the adventure phases may very well stretch out over more than one session in many cases. So might do the introduction, bring all the characters together, do the setup, get them moving into the middle phase where they're off on separate directions doing research, and then have to come back another week. Well, the thing here, what we're talking about is phases, is being mindful of where you are in your expected evening or afternoon or whatever of play. So, again, this is kind of an anti-immersion mission, is never get so immersed that you aren't aware of how much time you've spent versus how much time you're planning to spend. And this is something I think probably comes up more for Japanese role players because they're more inclined to perhaps play out at like a little cafe where you have to rent table space to play while you're there. People have plans that are tightly scheduled before and after, whenever you've scheduled your tabletop role-playing game session. And so there's a little more consciousness and conscientiousness about showing up on time, being prepared to play, being ready for the opening phase when you're scheduled to start. A little light chit chat to, while you're first getting there is probably all right, but that's a good reason to get there a few minutes early. You want to more or less start on time, and then be aware of how far along you are in the plan when you've scheduled to stop. So, in some cases, everybody at the table might be fine with just playing on an extra 30 or 45 minutes because something came up and it's interesting and you're having fun with it, or you got sidetracked, carried away, you decided to stop and have a meal break in the middle that you weren't planning on, whatever the case may be. um, if you're playing it a little loosey goosey on the schedule, that's fine if everybody's okay with it, but my preference is really to stick to the schedule as much as possible so that everybody can rely on starting on time and finishing on time. And the reason I'm bringing that up here is because if you're concerned about one-to-one time, is that potentially leaves your character out of your control in a dangerous situation or a potentially dangerous situation during a period of time when you're in between sessions, and so don't have direct control of what's going on with that character. One of the ways you can ameliorate the potential problems with that is to finish on time in a place that is more secure than having to spike a door of the dungeon and live off whatever you have in your wineskin and iron rations for a whole week. If you plan to remove yourself from the dungeon, even if it's to go to a camp outside, and here again, this goes on to my personal inclination to use a lot of hirelings and henchmen. So when I talk about going to the camp outside, it's not just some your horses were milling around the tents while you were inside the dungeon. You would have a whole staff there. You would potentially have cooks and bearers and men at arms guarding the treasure that you've brought out already, or really just your equipment and supplies kind of thing. So anyway, just nail down the phases of the game. So make sure you understand, every game then is going to have that, getting started phase, the opening phase of the session. And then the middle phase is mostly going to be play. You might not, if it's a multiple session game, reach the twist of the adventure and war end with a conclusion. But you also want to, in this case, bear in mind how far along you are in your planned or scheduled session, so that you don't get caught uh, at unawares at the 3 hour mark going, oh well, what are we going to do now? We're still in the middle of the dungeon. We were so sidetracked or having so much fun. Well, it's great that you're having that much fun, but don't get so sidetracked or so immersed that you aren't conscious of the fact that you should be getting ready to pack it up and have that done in a timely fashion. So the other parts of the pack time, the second thing is adventuring time. Now, if you compare that to something like Daredevils, which is another game that I've brought up on the channel so far because I'm trying to get to a place where we can play that live. So I've been rolling out the rules and dealing with making up characters and that sort of thing. The time system that they use is broken down into, like, there's detailed action turns, and that's done in 6 second intervals. So that is the time of like combat, as opposed to tactical time, which is fuzzy, but on the order of 10 minutes to an hour per tactical term, and it's meant to be relative and done on a sliding scale so that the GM can adjust it to whatever the needs of the situation are. But that's the idea is that the amount of time for each turn is going to be somewhere on the order of 10 minutes to an hour. Compared that to strategic time, which in the Daredevils game is meant to be some sort of fraction of a day, whether it would be, you do a check for, random encounters once for the day and once at night, or 2 times during the day, 2 times per night kind of thing. And it would be much more than that. So we're talking about, the sort of that iterative time, daytime, nighttime kind of thing, and you would check that every day, once in the day, once at night. Next day would be the same kind of check, once in the day, once at night. So you'd probably perform your role around the same time, or at least your assumption would be it's around the same time in game. Whenever you make that roll, that's what time it would apply to in the game world. So calendars, calendrical time is obviously day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year. That's the tracking that you really need to have in order for your characters and for their henchmen, or for your NPCs, to keep track of whatever is going on in the background. If the king sends out several knights to accomplish a mission, and those knights are going off for a few weeks and then coming back for a few weeks, and however much time they have to spend there, and that may, you never know, have some sort of impact on what's going on with the player characters or the party of the player characters in the kingdom while those knights are away. Maybe something comes up and they're the only ones there who can deal with it on the same level as those knights who were sent out by mission. That's not necessarily a planned quest, or something that the party comes up with on their own. It's just, if a random encounter affects the area while those knights are off on that mission that you're tracking on your calendrical time system, then you've got, that's where Gygax is talking about, you can't have a meaningful campaign unless accurate time records are kept. It's not about one-to-one time between sessions. It's about keeping track of all the moving parts that are going on during the session, and knowing how they intersect with each other in terms of in-game, in-world time. And then I guess talk a little bit about difference between tactical and strategic time for the Daredevils game. Getting back to something that's more generic, or that's D&D, AD&D first edition in particular. Clearly, when I talk about tactical time, I'm talking about things that are on the order of the segment or the round. It's going to be your time during combat. And when we talk about strategic time, um, that would be kind of the same thing that we're talking about with Daredevils. That's, that all goes together. I think in sort of a adventuring time would be, where you put strategic time, because that's how I use adventuring time. That's sort of the sliding scale. It can be, in this case, it would subsume what Daredevil is calling the strategic time, things that you check maybe once or twice during the day and once or twice during the night. But that might also then become the time of turns, 10-minute turns, or multiple 10-minute turns. So if you've got 6 turns per hour, something that you checked, every 24 turns might be, within that adventuring time. It's pretty much whatever you need between the tactical time of combat, which is going to be reckoned in 1-minute rounds and 6-second segments, and whatever you need in terms of calendrical time, which is going to be largely tracked in terms of days and weeks and months and years. And clearly there's some kind of play between that, which is the subsections of one particular day that aren't as narrowly focused as what you'd need for combat, and that would all kind of fall into that generic category of adventuring time. And I think what's another key about adventuring time is you just sort of have to be willing to play that out according to the needs of the moment during the session. So if you need to be thinking about tracking stuff in terms of 10-minute time in with the party, then that's what you do. If it doesn't matter, then you just might keep track of it, on your tracking sheets that you use as the DM. So things that are going on in the background the party has no knowledge of, there's no reason to include them. However, sometimes you might need to communicate with them about information that's being checked every few hours or every few blocks of 10-minute turns. So every 3 turns, you might need to check with them about something. And that all gets subsumed into adventuring time. So that's the PACT. It's be aware of the phase, not just the phase of the adventure, but the phase of the planned, scheduled session, and being aware of starting on time and stopping on time. And then the adventuring time is that sliding in-game time that you have. Calendrical time is obviously kept track of on a calendar, and again is going to be days and months and years. And then the tactical time is largely, at least in AD&D 1E, going to be the 1-minute round over which combat occurs. All of that, of course, can be subdivided into the 6-second segment. So you have those 10 segments. I played with the idea of, putting a tracker that would be downloadable for this video, but that changes so much between different gaming systems that I could put one out for AD&D 1E, and then if most people aren't keeping track of time for 1E, but some other game, maybe it's another flavor of Dungeons and Dragons, or maybe it's an entirely different game, kind of like Daredevils, that has its own kind of specified timekeeping system, then a tracker like that wouldn't be as useful. And so I just kind of let that go. I figured we'd just talk about it, and that would be good enough. So I think that's it for now. I'll probably, time is one of those core issues for me and for tabletop gaming just in general. So I'll probably want to return to it at some point to tease out some different details. But I think for now, I'll just end it and say thank you very much for watching the video, and I'll hope to see you again at the next one.